Joan Caputo, a member of the UU Meeting House of Chatham. I'm reading Stave 2, which means chapter 2, by the way, the first of the three spirits. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed, he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of the chamber. He was endeavoring to pierce the darkness with his ferret eyes when the chimes of a neighboring church struck the 4 quarters. So he listened for the bells. To his great astonishment, the heavy bell went on from 6 to 7 to 8 to 9 and regularly up to 12, then stopped. What? How could that be 12? It was past 2 when he went to bed. The clock was wrong. An icicle must have gotten into the works. 12? He touched the spring of his clock, which is called a repeater, but it's just a clock, to correct this most preposterous clock outside. His stupid little pulse beat 12 times and stopped. What? Why, it isn't possible, said Scrooge, that I can have slept through a whole day and far into another night. It isn't possible that anything has happened to the sun and that this is 12 noon. The idea being an alarming one, he scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. He was obliged to rub the frost off. Frost was on the inside of the windows back then. This was written a long time ago. He was obliged to rub the frost off with the sleeve of his dressing gown before he could see anything. And he could see very little then. All he could make out was that it was still very foggy and extremely cold, no people running to and fro and making a great stir, as there unquestionably would have been if night had beaten off bright day and taken possession of the world. This was a great relief because 3 days after sight of this first of exchange pay to Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge or his order and so forth would have become a mere United States security. Now here he's talking about his pay and that the way you got paid in England back when this book was written was not by the kind of money we're used to. And he's talking about the fact that without the days being correct, he wouldn't be able to cash his payment. Scrooge went to bed again and thought and thought and thought over and over and over and could make nothing of it. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was. And the more he endeavored not to think, the more he thought. We've all had that happen. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Remember, in the last reading, the ghost of his friend, Jacob Marley, came and talked to him about what had happened to him and what was likely to happen to Scrooge if he didn't experience what Jacob Marley was describing. Well, Scrooge, I think, in truth, was a little scared. I think I would be a little scared. Anyway, all he could make out that outside was very foggy and extremely cold. Anyway, he went back to bed, and every time he resolved within himself, after mature inquiry, that it was all a dream, his mind flew back again like a strong spring released to its first position and presented the same problem to be worked all through. Was it a dream or not? Scrooge lay in this state until the chime had gone 3 quarters more, when he remembered on a sudden that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. He resolved to be awake until the hour was past and considering that he could do no more, to go to sleep and go to heaven. This was perhaps the wisest resolution in his power. The quarter was so long that he was more than once convinced he must have sunk into a doze and unconsciously missed the clock. At length it broke upon his listening ear. Ding dong! It's 1:15, said Scrooge, counting. Ding dong! 1/2, said Scrooge. Ding dong! 1/4 to it, said Scrooge. Ding dong! The hour itself, said Scrooge. And nothing else. He spoke before the hour bell sounded, which it now did, with a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy 1. Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn. Back then, it was very cold in houses, and people slept in beds that had curtains all around them from top to bottom, and you pulled them close when you went to bed to keep out the chill, the cold. The hour itself. When the curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand, not the curtains at his feet, not the curtains at his back, but to those where his face was addressed. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge, starting up into a half-recumbent attitude, partway up, found himself face to face with an unearthly visitor who drew them as close to it as I am now to you. And I am standing in the spirit at your elbow. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from view and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white, as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were like those upper members, muscular and strong. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and wound around its waist was bound a luminous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and in singular contradiction to that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm. Now, we're not used to spirits or ghosts in our stories mostly, but if you think of characters like Spider-Man and like Superman, you will get the idea that this was a character that was not like most human beings that we know. It was special. Get here. Who are you and what are you? Scrooge demanded. I am the ghost of Christmas past. Long past? Inquired Scrooge, observant of its dwarfish stature. No, your past. Perhaps Scrooge could not have told anybody why, if anybody would have asked him, but he had a special desire to see the spirit in his cap and begged him to be covered. What? Exclaimed the ghost. Would you so soon put out with worldly hands the light I give? It is not enough that you are one of those whose passions make this cap and force me through whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow. Scrooge reverently disclaimed all intention to offend or any knowledge of having willfully bonneted the spirit at any period of his life. He then made hold to inquire what business brought him there. Your welfare, said the ghost. Scrooge expressed himself much obliged, but he could not help thinking that a night of unbroken rest would have been much more conducive to that end. The spirit must have heard him thinking, for it said immediately, Your reclamation, then. Take heed. It put out its strong hand as it spoke and clasped him gently by the arm. Rise and walk with me. It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that the bed was warm and the thermometer a long way below freezing, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap, and that he had a cold upon him at that time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, but finding the spirit made toward the window, clasped his robe in supplication. I am mortal, said Scrooge, a human being, and liable to fall. But bear just the touch of my hand then, said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, and you shall uphold in more than that. As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road with only fields on either side. The city had completely vanished. Not a vestige of it was to be seen. The darkness and the mist had melted away, and it was a clear, cold winter day with snow upon the ground. Good heavens, said Scrooge, clasping his hands together as he looked about him. I was bred in this place. I was a boy here. The spirit gazed upon him mildly. Its gentle touch, though it had been light and instantaneous, appeared still present on the old man's sense of feeling. He was conscious of 1,000 odors floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares, long, long forgotten over his long, long life. Your lip is trembling, said the ghost. And what is that upon your cheek? Scrooge muttered with an unusual catching in his voice that it was a pimple and begged the ghost to lead him where he would. You recollect the way? Inquired the spirit. Remember it, cried Scrooge. I could walk it blindfold. Strange to have forgotten it for so many years, observed the ghost. Let us go on. So in our next section, you'll learn where they went on. And this is about Scrooge's childhood and his boyhood and a time that he had long, long forgotten. And he has a lot of surprises coming.